Welcome to Age, Aging, Aged, and Ageism, a module in the COVID-19 and Society course. My name is Anne Martin Matthews, and in this course we'll be talking about a number of issues to do with aging and things that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, from the earliest days in March through to some of the issues that are prominent in society at this point in time. I am a professor of sociology at UBC, and I'm also the Associate Vice President Health at UBC, and I've been teaching in the area of aging for several decades now, mostly doing research in the area we would call social gerontology or sociology of aging. And like many people with interest in aging in particular, I've been quite horrified in many ways to see how aging has been treated in some of the narratives and popular media in relation to COVID-19. And then as the months have gone by, to actually see the disproportionate rate of death for elderly people from COVID-19 and the impact on older people of the lockdown associated with COVID-19. It's an interesting question what this says about societal attitudes toward aging in our society, the treatment of elderly people, and in general about ageism in Canada and globally. And those concerns prompted me to offer this module for this COVID-19 and Society course. So the structure of the course will be essentially in three sections. The first section will deal with issues of narratives of aging and ageism and how COVID-19 frames those narratives of decline about aging. The second section will talk about who cares in a pandemic, and will focus on long-term care in Canada. And in the third section, we'll reflect on how we as a society can move forward with and after COVID-19. What are some of the implications of the aging of the population and how that will be addressed in that context? There will be three cross-cutting themes throughout the discussion. One will focus on global and international perspectives, and you'll see those comparisons. The second will introduce some ideas of private troubles, public issues, and I know you're hearing about Mills and the sociological imagination in other modules in this course, so you should be able to do some comparison in terms of what we discuss here. And of course, ageism will be a focus, one of the topics that we'll talk about. So when you hear the terminology of the elderly, which is a language we hear a lot in COVID, what image comes to your mind when you hear those words? Is the image like the one on the left of my screen here, where you would think of a group of very elderly people, predominantly women, frail, in wheelchairs with mobility challenges, etc.? Is that the predominant image for you? Or is it in fact the image that you have on the other side of the screen? An extraordinarily fit elderly individual in this case, so fit, I hope you're able to see it, that she actually has her leg up the side of that tree, which many people in their 20s and 30s could not possibly do. So it's important to reflect on those contrasting images that we have before us, the binary, if you will, of what images we have of aging. Or in fact, is your image of aging, or even when someone says the elderly, is it somewhere on the continuum in between? And in fact, we know that most older people do live on that continuum in between. We have people who are aging extremely well, that we call them super agers. They just have so many physical attributes of people much younger than themselves. We have centenarians, more and more people living to be over 100 years of age. And then we've got people who are living their lives with a multiple of health conditions, but still living full and productive lives in their own homes, right through to more people who are more frail, people with dementia, etc. So we've got the entire continuum. And we know from previous offerings of my course, Sociology of Aging, Sociology Now 344, it's called, that many of you actually have experience of older people in your lives. That in previous times when I've taught the course, 7% of the class had great-grandparents alive. Anywhere from 45 to 50% actually had the experience of living with a grandparent in their upbringing. And about 17 to 20% had experience actually of living with a person over the age of 80. So those kinds of figures would suggest extensive experience and knowledge of that continuum on which older people reside. And we care about aging. We're all aging. And of course, we assume that many of you will not only live to old age, but you live a long time in old age. So for our next area of focus, we're just going to consider some of the headlines and hashtags which have been very prominent during the period of COVID-19. You can see immediately the way aging is represented in these headlines and hashtags. Boomer remover being one of the earlier ones, viewed in many cases on Instagram and Twitter, and extensively promoted during those early days of COVID in particular. We also have examples from the UK of journalists talking about how a cull of older people could actually benefit the economy. And certainly that's a perspective on aging of older people as disposable. In the USA, we similarly had a Texas official talking about the fact that, yes, older people are dying, but older people would rather die than let COVID-19 harm the economy of the United States. And then similarly, coming from the United States, this one, a more questioning line of inquiry. Why is it okay if just old people are dying of COVID-19? What does that say about us as a society that we would actually think that that was just fine? And the pervasiveness of these views is evident in some of these headlines that you'll see here from South America, where age is clearly a criterion in many cases for mandatory quarantine in some countries. It's age is a criteria for policies requiring people to carry permits, for decisions on who will have access to treatment, and in other words, in terms of who will survive this particular crisis. As well, from other parts of the world, from the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, prevalence of age-based lockdown rules, simply saying if you're over the age of 80, you have certain kinds of requirements for lockdown, regardless of your health condition. Age alone being the criteria. In the Netherlands, we see another headline where elderly people were advised not to go to the ICU, intensive care units, that was considered a waste of time and a waste of resources. So what do these headlines and policies reflect? They reflect, we would argue, ageism. And ageism is a term that was coined by Robert Butler in the US in the late 1960s. And ageism is defined here as a process of systematic stereotyping or discrimination against people because they are old. So on the basis of that single criterion. In that respect, it's similar to racism and sexism, of course. What happens is that you see older people as different or an other. They're in another category of other person. And in many cases, then aging becomes equated with the 3 Ds: disease, disability, and death. And many would argue that the pandemic made this narrative of decline around old age even more pronounced and pervasive than it had been before. We also know that ageism occurs at both individual and institutional levels. At individual levels, we see it in terms of stereotypes, myths, outright dislike, avoiding contact. And at institutional levels, in terms of discriminatory policies in age, in housing, employment, and services. And we certainly have already seen evidence of some of those policies and their consequences. Ageism also manifests itself in terms of what we call the homogenization of older people. That is, everybody over the age of 65 is alike, And secondly, in terms of, as I've noted already, assumptions of old age is equaling frailty and vulnerability. But we actually know if you take 60 or 65 as the point of onset to old age as we know it in Canada, it's because of eligibility for old age security. So let's take age 65, that many people have 40 to 50 years of life. People can live into their 90s, 100, 105, some to 115. So there's a very broad span of years that are encompassed by old age. So again, this notion of the elderly is capturing 2, if not 3 generations over the age of 65. And we know in Canada that at least 10% of those over the age of 65 have a child who's also over the age of 65. And those statistics are from 2011 census data, so the figure could currently be higher. I certainly, in my own network of friends, know many people who might say be 73 with a mother 101, or an individual in his or her 60s with parents in their 80s and 90s. Not at all uncommon. We also have population aging in 2 ways. It's impacting society because more people are living to old age. Actually, historically unprecedented, the proportions of people who are living to 65, but also, and relevant to our argument here about the elderly and homogenization, more people are living longer in old age. After they turn 65, living for many more years than we ever had previously. So this as well plays into the whole issue of the diversity of the population as people get older. And in fact, we do know that people become more unlike one another as they get older. You can know more about knowing a person is age 4 than you can by knowing a person is age 85. So we have many examples of older people contributing to society, far from that rhetoric of decline and frailty. And one example that's on the slide here is even in the United States, and Anthony Fauci, who ironically is the person talking to us about COVID in that country's context much of the time. And he's age 79. In Canada, of course, there are other people who may be able to be role models in terms of later life. I'm thinking, for example, in the United States, where we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice at age 85. But of course, in Canada, we actually require Supreme Court justices to retire at age 75. We also have an issue in relation to COVID, another aspect of ageism, and that is age-based lockdown and quarantine policies. And I've noted some of those already. But we actually know that in Canada, most of the people who were infected with COVID are under the age of 60, but the median age of those who died is age 84. And we could see this coming. This was pretty evident as you look at the headlines here, that in so many parts of the world, the people who were dying were not only elderly, but they were people in care homes, in long-term care facilities, or sometimes called nursing homes. You can see this here in headlines from South America. This actually came around the same time as Canada's experience of COVID, but even earlier in some of the stories that were coming out of other parts of the world. Similarly, age was quite strongly recognized when, in fact, very elderly people were surviving. So that was another language of aging that appeared in the popular media and was celebrated in many cases. That astonishing that older people could actually survive into to live beyond COVID itself. So in the next section of this course, we're going to talk about what actually happened when COVID struck Canada, where the tragedy really did lie, as the headline here from CTV News states, the crisis in long-term care homes. We're going to focus on what the pandemic exposed, what the military made the public aware of in terms of what was going on, and we'll frame that in terms of who cares, aging and long-term care in Canada. But before we get to section 2, we're going to do a poll.